800 ships entered and left this harbor on a single day by one traveler's count. Grain from the Black Sea, silk from Persia, spices from Egypt, timber from the Anatolian forests. The docks were a wall of sound before sunrise, ropes straining, cargo shifting, sailors calling to each other in Greek, Arabic, Turkish, Italian, Ladino, languages that had no business being in the same sentence colliding at the waterfront without ceremony, because this was simply how the port of Istanbul worked in the year 1550. Walk up from the docks into the city, and the noise doesn't stop. It changes. The Grand Bazaar sits on the slope of the third hill. 61 covered streets, more than 4,000 shops, a self-contained city of commerce inside the city itself, its stone gates locked every night by watchmen. Inside, the distinctions that govern life outside dissolve for the hours between morning prayer and evening prayer. A Turkish cloth merchant haggles with a Greek shipowner over the price of Bursa silk. An Armenian jeweler sets stones for a Jewish banker's wife. The transaction gets conducted in a mixture of languages nobody is named because nobody needed to. Step outside the bazaar and the city's geography tells you who lives where. The Greek patriarch holds court in Fener, his compound, a city within the city. Its own courts, its own schools. Greek children learning Greek in a city where the Sultan speaks Turkish and the streets carry Arabic on Fridays. The Jewish neighborhoods along the Golden Horn are close enough to the port that a merchant can watch ships unload from his synagogue window. 30,000 Jews live here. Yes, in 44 synagogues, organized not just by religion, but by the Spanish cities their grandparents fled. Castilians in one congregation, Aragonese in another, Portuguese in a third. In Galata, across the water, Italian and French merchants run their pharmacies and their taverns, operating under Ottoman law, paying their taxes, living their lives. And above all of it, on the third hill, the city's chief architect is building a mosque complex that will take 7 years to finish. Its dome visible from the Asian shore of the Bosphorus. Its foundation endowment already written to fund a hospital, a soup kitchen, 4 colleges, and a primary school in perpetuity. The architect's name is Sinan. He was born Christian in a village in Anatolia, taken as a boy and trained in the Sultan's palace school. He is now the greatest builder of his age, remaking the skyline of the world's largest city in stone and lead and light. A Chinese geographer, working from traveler accounts on the other side of the world, sat down around this time to describe Istanbul in a few lines. He noted the walls. He noted the sovereign prince. He noted that there were Muslims wearing head wraps and people who looked like Han Chinese. And then, almost as an aside, the detail he apparently found most worth recording, there were translators. That a scholar 4,000 miles away, trying to capture this city in a sentence, landed on that single word tells you something. Not the size, 700,000 people, the largest city on earth, a figure London would not reach for another 200 years. Not the power, the empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. What struck him was that people there needed to speak across languages to each other as a matter of daily life. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans governed something that has no clean name in our political vocabulary. At its widest extent, it held perhaps a third of the world's known population, administered in dozens of languages, under rulers who were simultaneously the heirs of the Mongol steppe, the successors of the Byzantine Caesars, and the custodians of the holiest sites in Islam. The system they built to hold all of this together, for governing Christians and Jews and Muslims and dozens of peoples without demanding they become the same thing, was improvised over generations, revised under pressure, and never fully finished. What it was, in practice, was a sustained wager on the possibility that different peoples could share the same geography without destroying each other. That wager lasted 600 years. Then it failed. And the world that replaced it, The world of nation-states, of ethnic homelands, of borders drawn in London and Paris, produced, across the exact same geography, a century of war, population exchange, and genocide that killed millions and left wounds still open today. This is the history of how that empire was built, how it governed, how it decayed, and what it means that it is gone. To understand any of it, you have to go back to the beginning, to a frontier town in northwest Anatolia, to a small clan of warriors on the edge of a collapsing world, to a dream that an empire would one day tell about itself for 600 years. You just saw the city it all became. Istanbul in 1550, 500,000 people, 44 synagogues, coffee houses filling faster than the city could count them, the greatest architect in the world, building domes above the Bosphorus. An empire stretching from Vienna to the Persian Gulf, governing a third of the known world under a single roof. Now go back 250 years. Go back to where it started, a small town called Sout in the northwest corner of Anatolia, a clan of maybe 400 families, a young leader who had just inherited command from his father, whose territory amounted to a few valleys of pasture land on the edge of a crumbling empire. His name was Osman. The word Ottoman comes from his name. And in the year 1299, when he declared his independence from the weakening Seljuk state that had been his nominal overlord, he controlled roughly the same amount of territory as a mid-sized county in rural England. From that, from 400 families and a few valleys, came 600 years of empire. The world Osman was born into was a world falling apart at every seam. To his east, the Mongols had destroyed everything. Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, home to the House of Wisdom and 5 centuries of accumulated scholarship, had been burned to the ground in 1258, the year of Osman's birth. The Caliph was dead. The Islamic world's center of gravity had been obliterated. Hundreds of thousands of people, warriors, scholars, merchants, dervishes, farmers with no land to return to, were moving west, or looking for somewhere to go, pushing into Anatolia with nothing but what they could carry. To his west, the Byzantine Empire was dying slowly. Constantinople still stood, still called itself the successor of Rome, still maintained its court and its ceremonies and its patriarch. But its territory had been shrinking for 2 centuries. Its army was a shadow of what it had been. Its frontier towns in Bithynia, the region directly west of Osman's pastures, were barely garrisoned, administered sporadically, taxed heavily enough that the local populations had lost any particular attachment to Byzantine authority. The empire was still there. It just wasn't really governing anymore. Osman sat between these 2 collapsing worlds, and that position, which looked like nothing, was everything. The powerful Turkish principalities to his east, larger, richer, better established, had already divided up the Anatolian interior between them. They were busy competing with each other, raiding each other, burning each other's resources in the endless friction of neighboring powers. Osman had none of that to worry about. He had one direction to expand: west, into the Byzantine borderlands, into territory that the empire could no longer defend and whose people had limited reasons to resist. Every warrior displaced by the Mongols who wanted a fight came to Osman's frontier. Every dervish and holy man who wanted to carry Islam westward toward Constantinople came to Osman's frontier. Every Byzantine deserter, every farmer looking for protection, every adventurer who wanted land and had heard that land was available in the northwest. They all came. The frontier was a magnet, and Osman understood how to use it. There's a dream attached to his name that the Ottomans told for 600 years. He was sleeping as a guest in the house of a Sufi sheikh whose daughter he wished to marry. The sheikh had refused him. That night, Osman dreamed that a moon rose from the old man's chest and descended into his own. A tree grew from his navel and spread until its branches covered the world. Rivers ran down from mountains beneath it, and people drank from them, built fountains in the shade. Every leaf of the tree was shaped like a scimitar. A wind came and turned every blade toward the cities of the world. And especially, the dream was precise about this, toward one city. A city at the junction of two seas and two continents, gleaming like a diamond set between sapphires and emeralds. When Osman told the sheikh what he had seen, the old man gave him his daughter. He told him that God had granted the imperial office to him and to his descendants. The Ottoman chroniclers who wrote this story down did so more than 100 years after Osman's death, when the empire was already vast and powerful and in need of a beginning equal to its size. The diamond city the dream pointed toward, Constantinople, had already fallen to Osman's great-great-great-grandson by the time anyone wrote the dream down. The tree had already spread across 3 continents. Whether Osman actually had that dream on that night in that borrowed room, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the Ottomans told it, kept it, yes, built their identity around it. It says something true about how they understood themselves, chosen, purposeful, moving toward something specific. Not a raiding party that got lucky, a dynasty with a divine commission. The first real test came in 1301 or 1302 at a place called Bapheus, near the Byzantine city of Nicaea. The Byzantine governor of the region had watched Osman's forces growing for years, conducting raids deeper into Byzantine territory, attracting more followers, becoming harder to ignore. He marched against Osman with a professional army to end it. Osman met him in the open field and defeated him. It was one battle among dozens happening across Anatolia that year. It was not enormous, but word of it traveled. A small frontier principality had beaten a Byzantine professional army in the open field. We warriors who had been weighing their options made their decision. More came. The territory grew. The raids deepened. Byzantine settlers began withdrawing from the Anatolian countryside toward the coastal cities than in Constantinople itself, ceding the interior by degrees. Osman spent the rest of his life pushing. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the Byzantine borderland gave way. He never took a major city himself. Bursa, the first real prize, fell to his son just as Osman was dying, around 1326. But by the time he died, the principality his father had left him had been transformed into something with the unmistakable weight of a state. It held territory. It administered towns. It collected taxes. It had the beginning of institutions. He was buried in Sout first, the frontier town where it had all started, then reinterred in Bursa, and the first real capital. For the next 600 years, every Ottoman sultan who came to power made a pilgrimage to Bursa to be girded with Osman's sword, the founder's blade strapped to their hip as the ceremony that made a sultan a sultan. 600 years of sultans. 600 years of that ritual. It all started with 400 families and a dream about a tree. The empire those families built would grow to govern 30 languages and 3 major religions across 3 continents. It would take Constantinople and make it its own. It would build the coffee houses and the bazaars and the printing presses you heard about in the opening. It would develop a system of governance so unusual, so deliberately designed for plurality, is that a Chinese scholar 4,000 miles away would reach for one word to describe the city it produced. But before you can understand how it governed, you have to understand what it built to govern with: the machinery, the system. The 2 great inventions that made Ottoman control possible across a territory no single army could police and no single language could administer. That is where we go next. The sword of Osman girded each new sultan at the start of his reign. It was kept in Bursa, in the tomb of the founder, and the ceremony of receiving it, of strapping the founder's blade to your hip in the city where the empire had its first real capital, was the moment a sultan became a sultan in more than name. 600 years of sultans made that journey. The sword outlasted most of what surrounded it. But swords alone do not hold territory. They take it. The harder problem, the one that the Ottomans spent the first 2 centuries of their empire working out in practice rather than theory, was how to govern what the sword had won. How do you administer 30 languages and 3 major religions, dozens of peoples with their own laws and customs and hierarchies, across a territory larger than Western Europe? The answer the Ottomans arrived at was both more practical and more strange than anything their contemporaries were attempting. It had 2 main parts. One was the Devshirme. The other was the Millet. Together, they were the architecture of Ottoman control. The Devshirme was the older of the 2, and the stranger. Every few years, Ottoman officers rode into the villages of the Balkans. They carried official registers. They were looking for boys, healthy, strong, between roughly 8 and 20 years old, from the Christian communities that the empire governed. The boys selected were taken to Istanbul, converted to Islam, given new names, then placed with Turkish families in Anatolia for several years to learn the language and absorb the culture. The brightest among them eventually entered the Enderun, the palace school inside Topkapi, where they spent years studying Arabic, Persian, Turkish, mathematics, music, calligraphy, theology, horsemanship, and the arts of administration. The rest were assigned to the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite infantry. All of them, by the system's design, were separated from the world they had come from. Their loyalty ran to the Sultan and to no one else. The grief this produced was real. Families resisted when they could. Some communities arranged early marriages before the officers arrived. Some priests altered their records. A Byzantine scholar of the period wrote that the system threatened the continuity of family life, that a father would not have his son to send him to his grave in fitting manner. That sorrow is part of the historical record and deserves to be acknowledged. What the system produced for the empire was something no hereditary aristocracy could deliver. An administrative class with no ancestral land, no tribal loyalty, no family fortune to protect. A boy taken from a Balkan village and trained for 15 years in Topkapi owed his entire existence to the Sultan. He could not build a dynasty. He could not accumulate the kind of independent power that had destabilized every other Islamic state the Ottomans had watched rise and fall around them. The Devshirme created men whose roots were the empire itself, and for 2 centuries, it worked. One of those men is worth following in particular. His story is the system made visible, what it took, what it built, and what it could not quite erase. His name at birth was Bajika Nenadic. He was born around 1506 in a Serbian Orthodox village in Bosnia. When the Devshirme officers came through Bosnia during the early years of Suleiman's reign, they took him. The name Bajika was gone from that moment. He was converted to Islam, given a new name, Sokolu Mehmed, and placed in the palace school in Istanbul. What the boy from Bosnia thought about any of this? No source records. What the records show is what he did next. He began to climb. He climbed for decades, commander of the Imperial Guard, High Admiral of the Fleet, Governor-General of Rumelia, meaning he governed the entire Ottoman Balkans, the very territories from which he had been taken as a child. Grand Vizier in 1565, the highest administrative office in the empire below the Sultan himself, a position he held for 14 years across the reigns of 3 sultans. He married Suleiman the Magnificent's granddaughter. He commanded armies. He managed successions. When Suleiman died during the siege of Sigitvar in 1566, he was the one who kept the Sultan's death secret for 48 days, managing the army's loyalty and the transfer of power with a steadiness that held the empire together at its most vulnerable moment. In 1551, while serving as Governor-General of Rumelia, he encountered his birth mother somewhere in the Balkans. She recognized him by a birthmark on his face. He had become, by that point, the most powerful administrator in the empire, the man who ran 3 sultans' governments. And his mother knew him by a birthmark. That meeting contains the compressed weight of what the Devshirme did to the people it took. It separated them from everything they had been, and it did not, in the end, erase them entirely. Suleiman Mehmed maintained quiet relationships with his Serbian family throughout his career. His brother became a monk at the Serbian Orthodox monastery of Hilandar on Mount Athos. In 1557, the 2 brothers sat together in the Grand Vizier's palace in Istanbul. That same year, Suleiman Mehmed issued an imperial decree restoring the Serbian Patriarchate of Pech, which had been abolished for decades. His own cousin was appointed the new Serbian Patriarch, a man taken from a Serbian Orthodox village as a child, governing the Ottoman Empire at its height, using the Sultan's authority to restore the church of his ancestors. The Devshirme produced lives that resist simple categories. It was coercive. The grief it caused was documented. Most of the 530 boys recorded in a single register from the villages around Bursa in 1603 are names in a list. Their later lives unknown. Suleiman Mehmed was the exception. But his story reveals something true about the system's logic. It was not designed to destroy the people it took. It was designed to redirect them, to make their talent and their loyalty available to an empire that had decided very deliberately that talent should flow upward regardless of where it started. The other half of the architecture that kept the Ottoman Empire together was the Millet, and it worked on an entirely different logic. Where the Devshirme reached inside communities to extract individuals and reshape them, the Millet left communities as they were and governed them through their own existing structures. The word itself originally meant simply religious community. The Ottomans gave it administrative weight. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the conqueror formally recognized 3 millets: Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Jewish, each with its own patriarch or chief rabbi at the head, each with jurisdiction over its own community's internal affairs. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, education, religious practice. All of these were governed by the community's own laws and courts. The Ottoman state dealt with non-Muslims not as individuals, but as members of their community, and each community's leader was responsible to the Sultan for his people's loyalty and their tax obligations. In practical terms, this meant that a Greek doctor in Thessaloniki and an Armenian merchant in Bursa and a Jewish banker in Istanbul each lived primarily inside his own communal world. He was born and married and buried according to his own rights. He educated his children in his own language. He brought his disputes to his own community's court. What he owed the Ottoman state was the saizi, the poll tax levied on non-Muslim subjects, and his community's general loyalty to the Sultan. Beyond that, as in ordinary daily life, the Ottoman state largely left him alone. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch, seated in the Fener district of Istanbul, governed Christians not just in Anatolia and the Balkans, but across the Arab world. Arab Orthodox Christians found themselves under a Greek-speaking institution in Constantinople simply because the Ottomans organized their subjects by religion rather than language or ethnicity. The Armenian Patriarch governed a community stretching from Istanbul eastward across Anatolia. The chief rabbi governed Jewish communities dispersed across the entire empire. Each of these men held a document from the Sultan called a Barat, setting out his rights and his responsibilities, making him simultaneously a religious leader and an imperial official. Yet the records the Ottomans kept reveal how seriously they took this system. The Jewish community of Istanbul by the mid-16th century comprised dozens of distinct congregations organized by the cities their grandparents had fled. Synagogues for Jews from Castile, from Aragon, from Portugal, from Corfu, from Apulia. The Sephardic Jews who arrived after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, roughly 100,000 of them, welcomed by the Sultan of the time, who reportedly observed that the Spanish king had impoverished his own kingdom and enriched the Ottoman one, brought the Ladino language and the intellectual culture of Iberian Jewry with them, and kept both alive for generations inside the Millet structure. The first printing press in the Ottoman Empire was established by two of these Spanish Jewish refugees in Istanbul in 1493, 1 year after their expulsion. They printed in Hebrew. The Ottoman state had no objection. This was the cosmopolitan gamble in its fullest expression. The empire had built a system that did not require its subjects to become Turkish or Muslim or Ottoman in any cultural sense. It asked only for loyalty and taxes. In return, it offered something genuinely rare in the 15th and 16th century world: the right to be different without being destroyed for it. Communities expelled from Spain, from the German principalities, from Bohemia, all found refuge in Ottoman cities. The Greek Orthodox Church, which Byzantine emperors had spent centuries trying to bring into theological alignment with Rome, survived the fall of Constantinople with its theology intact and its patriarch installed in the imperial capital. Armenians built their own churches, ran their own schools, conducted their own commerce across the empire's eastern territories. The system was not equality. Non-Muslim subjects paid taxes that Muslims did not. They faced legal restrictions. The shoe colors in the Grand Bazaar encoded their status visibly, and the prohibition on building new houses of worship in some periods was a real constraint. The tolerance was genuine, and the hierarchy was also genuine. Both things were true simultaneously, and understanding the Ottoman Empire requires holding both without collapsing one into the other. What the Millet produced in the cities where it operated most visibly was a density of coexistence that had no parallel in the 16th century world. A Greek merchant, a Jewish printer, a Turkish bureaucrat, and an Armenian jeweler could all be conducting business within a few hundred meters of each other in Istanbul on the same Tuesday morning, each operating primarily within his own communal world, each occasionally crossing into the others through the shared spaces of the bazaar and the coffee house and the waterfront. The empire held all of them, not by making them the same, but by making their differences administratively legible and, within limits, governable. A Serbian boy taken from his village and trained in the Sultan's palace could become Grand Vizier and restore his ancestral church. A Spanish Jew arriving with nothing could establish the empire's first printing press. Yet the system that made both of these things possible was the same system, built on the same premise: that the Ottoman state cared primarily about loyalty and function and was prepared, when within the hierarchies it maintained, to be surprisingly indifferent about everything else. That indifference had limits, and nowhere were those limits more visible or more consequential than at the very top of the empire, in the reign of the man who took it to its greatest height, and who contained within his own life every contradiction the system had built. But before we reach that man, we need to stand inside the world the system produced, the city it made, the daily life it generated, because the Millet and the Devshirme were not abstractions. They were the architecture behind a specific place at a specific moment that has never quite been replicated since. To understand what the Ottomans built, you have to stand inside it. The system described in the previous section, the Devshirme, the Millet, the machinery of administration, did not exist as theory. It existed as a city. And by the middle of the 16th century, that city was unlike anything else on earth. Istanbul in 1550 held roughly 500,000 people. 60% of them were Muslim, 30% were Christian, Greek, Armenian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Albanian, each community in its own quarter, each quarter with its own patriarch or bishop, its own courts, its own schools, its own language. The remaining 10% were Jewish, 30,000 of them, organized into 44 synagogues divided not just by theology, but by geography of origin. Which Spanish city, which German principality, which Italian port their grandparents had fled from. The city was not a melting pot. It was something more deliberate and more strange than that. It was a city of distinct, maintained communities living at close quarters, governed by a state that was genuinely indifferent to which god you prayed to, provided you paid your taxes and kept your peace. The neighborhoods made the system visible. The Greek community ran along the Marmara coastline and concentrated in Fener, where the patriarch held his court in a compound that functioned as a city within the city. Its own religious courts, its own charitable foundations, its own schools teaching Greek to children who would grow up as Ottoman subjects and die never having spoken Turkish as their primary language. The Armenian Patriarch's compound sat in Samatya, governing a community that stretched from Istanbul eastward across Anatolia to the frontier with Persia. The Jewish neighborhoods in Balat and Sarai along the Golden Horn were close enough to the port that a merchant could watch the ships unloading from the window of his synagogue. None of these communities was invisible to the others. They shared walls, they shared markets, they shared the streets leading down to the water and the water itself, and the boats that crossed it. What they maintained behind the walls of their own neighborhoods and communal institutions was a separate interior life that the Ottoman state had agreed, by the logic of the Millet, to leave alone. The place where those interior lives most visibly dissolved into each other was the Grand Bazaar. It had been built by the conqueror in 1455. In 2 years after he took the city, a covered market on the slope of the third hill, constructed in stone when most of the city's commercial buildings were still wood, endowed to the charitable foundation of the Hagia Sophia Mosque so that the rents from its shops would fund the converted cathedral's upkeep. By the 16th century, it had grown into something that had no equivalent anywhere in the world. 61 covered streets, more than 4,000 shops, vaulted ceilings, stone gates that were locked at night by watchmen. A self-contained city of commerce operating inside the city of Istanbul, and inside it, the distinctions of the Millet system became, for the hours between the morning prayer and the evening one, largely theoretical. A Turkish cloth merchant haggled with a Greek shipowner over the price of Bursa silk. An Armenian jeweler set stones for a Jewish banker's wife. A Spanish-born rabbi, printing books in Hebrew at his press in Galata, sent his apprentice to buy paper from a supplier in the bazaar who was almost certainly Muslim, and the transaction was conducted in a mixture of Turkish and Ladino that neither man would have been able to explain to a grammarian. The bazaar ran on a guild system that the Ottomans administered with their characteristic bureaucratic precision, each trade organized, each price subject to regulation, each guild with its own elected leadership approved by the imperial court. The increasing weight of Greek, Armenian, and Jewish merchants in the bazaar's trade was documented in the guild records with the same administrative neutrality that the Ottomans brought to everything they counted. They counted everything. The Ottoman state was among the most record-obsessed governments in the history of governance. Population registers, tax surveys, guild rolls, inheritance inventories, court records, property deeds. The empire generated paperwork at a rate that still astonishes the historians who work through its archives. A single provincial survey from the 1530s might record not just the number of households in a village, but the names of the heads of household, their religious affiliation, their tax obligations, the number of their livestock, and the condition of their fields. This obsession with registration was not administrative vanity. It was the mechanism by which the Millet system actually functioned. You could only govern communities through their own institutions if you knew precisely who belonged to which community, where they lived, what they owed. In 1554, 2 merchants arrived in Istanbul from Syria. One was from Aleppo, one from Damascus. They rented a space in Tadakale, the commercial district near the port, in a neighborhood already so thoroughly mixed that its residents were primarily Persian, Indian, North African, and Spanish Jewish. They set up a counter, brought out a copper pot, and began selling a drink that had been common in Yemen and Cairo for a generation, but had only recently reached Istanbul. Coffee. Within a year, the space they had rented was not enough. More shops opened in Tahtakale, then in other neighborhoods. By 1560, there were 50 coffee houses in Istanbul. By the end of the century, 600. By the 19th century, the 2,500, one for every 160 residents of a city that by then held 400,000 people. The coffee house, kahvehane in Turkish, was something that had not previously existed in Muslim urban life. Before it, the home, the mosque, and the shop were the three spaces where a man conducted his social existence. The home was private and family-bound. The mosque was religious and constrained by its own proprieties. The shop was commercial. The coffee house was none of these things. It was a space where a man could sit for hours, pay nothing beyond the price of a drink, and talk to whoever happened to be sitting near him. It drew men from every level of Ottoman society, artisans and merchants, scholars and soldiers, poets and bureaucrats, and, according to the more alarmed accounts of the period, thieves and runaway slaves and debt collectors. The government sent spies to listen. Sultans tried to close the coffee houses multiple times over the following century because places where the lower orders congregated and discussed current affairs were, in the reasonable assessment of any autocratic government, a threat. The coffee houses survived every prohibition. They were too useful, too embedded, too fundamental to the social fabric of a city that had no other space for the kind of unstructured conversation that urban life requires. Inside them, storytellers performed for audiences who paid in attention. Musicians played, men played chess and backgammon. Poetry was recited and argued over. The news of the empire, military campaigns, succession rumors, price increases, and of the doings of provincial governors, moved through the coffee houses of Istanbul faster than any official communication could carry it. A piece of gossip from the palace could reach a coffee seller in Tahtakale within a day. The coffee house was also where the empire's contradictions were most openly visible. A Greek merchant and a Turkish janissary might share a table in a Tahtakale kahvehane, united by their preference for the same storyteller. Outside, those same two men lived inside completely different institutional worlds. Different courts, different tax obligations, different legal statuses, different routes to power. The coffee house was the crack in the wall where the city's separate communities leaked into each other. The hammam, the public bath, was another such crack. Istanbul in the 16th century had more than 150 hammams distributed across all its neighborhoods. They were built by the charitable foundations of sultans and wealthy officials as endowments to their communities, and they served a function that went beyond hygiene. The hammam was the one space where a man's external markers of identity, his shoes, his turban, his coat, the specific cut of cloth that identified his religion and his profession, were absent. In the undressing room and in the steam of the bath itself, the architecture of identity that the Millet had built fell away temporarily, and what remained were men in a room sharing hot water. Whether this produced anything more than cleanliness and occasional conversation is difficult to say. Yes, but the hammam's existence as a shared space across religious and class lines was part of the texture of the city. The schools, the madrasis attached to the great mosque complexes, operated differently. They were Islamic institutions teaching theology and jurisprudence and the sciences to Muslim students, and their faculties were among the most respected in the Islamic world. But the knowledge that flowed through them was not sealed off from the rest of the city. Jewish physicians trained in Iberian medicine practiced at the Ottoman court and were consulted by Muslim officials. Armenian architects worked alongside Muslim ones in the construction of the great mosque complexes. Greek Orthodox scholars, operating within the Patriarch's compound in Fener, maintained libraries that preserved classical Greek manuscripts in a city where the conqueror himself had expressed a documented interest in Greek philosophy. Knowledge moved across the Millet's walls through the channels of commerce, patronage, and proximity. This was the city at its height. It was not a city of equality. The shoe colors in the Grand Bazaar were a daily reminder of that, and the poll tax paid by non-Muslims at the start of each year was a more material one. The tolerance the Millet system provided was real, and it had a price, and the price was paid by the people it tolerated. But within those terms, within the hierarchies that Ottoman society accepted as given, what the city produced was a density of coexistence that had no parallel in the 16th century world. In 1550, the year our Chinese geographer was trying to describe it from 4,000 miles away, Istanbul was building simultaneously. The Suleimaniye mosque complex, which would take 7 years to complete, and which contained not just the mosque but 4 madrasas, a hospital, a caravanserai, a soup kitchen, a primary school, and a bath, all endowed to operate in perpetuity, and a Hebrew printing press in Galata, and a coffee house in Tadakale, and the workshops of Armenian goldsmiths in the Grand Bazaar, and the Patriarch's School in Fener, teaching Greek to children whose grandparents had watched the conqueror ride into their city. All of these things were happening at once. All of them were, in their different ways, the Ottoman system expressing itself through the lives of the people living inside it. And the city the Ottomans had built by this point was not an accident of geography or a side effect of conquest. It was a deliberate production, imperfect, unequal, maintained by force when necessary, but deliberate. The question that would occupy the empire for the next 3 centuries was whether it could hold. Answering that question requires understanding the machine that had built it, not the administrative machinery of the previous section, but the military machine that had taken, in 2 generations, a frontier principality in Anatolia and turned it into the power governing half the known world. The city we have just been walking through, its coffee houses and bazaars and hammams and printing presses, its 500,000 people speaking 30 languages across 6 miles of hills above the Bosphorus, did not exist by accident. It existed because of what an Ottoman army did on the 29th of May, 1453, and because of what that army had been doing without significant interruption for the 150 years before that date. To understand how the Ottoman Empire was built, you have to understand something about the machine that built it. The Ottomans were not, at their core, unusual in wanting to conquer. Every state in the medieval world wanted territory. What made the Ottomans different was the precision and professionalism with which they went about acquiring it, and one specific technological advantage that, once they had it, made them effectively unstoppable against any opponent who did not. The Janissaries were part of it, but only part. Professional infantry, trained together, loyal only to the Sultan, armed with firearms decades before most European armies made the transition. They have been introduced already. What they could do in the field was hold disciplined lines while cavalry broke against them, and advance steadily through defensive fire without the kind of mass panic that destroyed feudal armies when their formation dissolved. They were a military instrument with no equivalent in the medieval world. The other part was the artillery. By the 1440s, the Ottoman sultans were commissioning siege guns of a scale no foundry in Europe had yet attempted. The largest cannon cast for the siege of Constantinople was 9 meters long. Its mouth was 1 meter across. It fired a stone ball weighing 500 kilograms, and that ball traveled 1.5 kilometers before it landed. The gun was so large that loading and cooling it between shots took 3 hours. It could be fired 7 times in a day. Around it, dozens of smaller guns fired more than 100 times each. The Byzantines had first been offered this cannon. Its inventor, a Hungarian engineer, had gone to Constantinople first and made his offer to the emperor. The emperor could not meet his price. The engineer took his plans east to the Ottoman court, and the Sultan hired him immediately. The cannon the emperor could not afford was aimed at his walls in the spring of 1453. Those walls had stood for 1,000 years. The Theodosian fortifications, built in the 5th century, reinforced across 10 centuries of siege and crisis, were the greatest defensive works in the medieval world. 14 miles of layered stone, protected on 3 sides by water, was studded with towers every 50 meters. They had held against Arab armies, Bulgarian armies, Crusader fleets, Mongol raiders. The city's inhabitants had survived so many sieges over so many centuries that survival had become, in some sense, a theological conviction. Constantinople stood because God willed it to stand. The emperor who prepared to defend it in 1453 had inherited what one Byzantine historian called a ruinous inheritance. His empire, which had once stretched from the Euphrates to the Adriatic, had been reduced by war, plague, and poverty to the city itself and a scattering of coastal settlements. The population inside the walls had fallen from 400,000 at its height to somewhere between 40 and 50,000. The treasury was empty. An appeal to the Pope for Western military assistance had produced, after years of negotiation, the arrival of 200 archers funded by the Vatican and 700 Genoese soldiers who had come on their own conscience, without official backing, because they believed the city should be defended. 7,000 defenders in total, against somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Ottoman troops assembled outside the walls in the first week of April, 1453. The siege lasted 53 days. Each morning, the great cannon and its companions fired into the Theodosian walls. Each section that crumbled was repaired by the defenders at night. The emperor moved along the walls himself, appearing wherever the pressure was greatest, shoring up morale with his presence because he had nothing else left to give. He had sent letters to Venice, to Hungary, to the Holy Roman Emperor, and to every Christian ruler in Europe. Some had promised ships, none had arrived. In the 3rd week of April, the Ottoman fleet found the harbor chain still blocking the Golden Horn. The chain stretched across the harbor mouth, each link weighing more than 500 kilograms, anchored on both shores. Ships could not enter. So the Sultan ordered his ships moved overland. 70 galleys were hauled up from the Bosphorus on greased wooden rollers, dragged uphill through the forests behind the Genoese quarter of Galata, and relaunched down the other side into the harbor. It was conducted at night in near silence by teams of men working by torchlight. Byzantine sentries, watching the harbor chain, saw nothing until dawn. Then they saw 70 Ottoman warships floating inside the harbor they had sealed. The emperor now had to stretch his 7,000 men across a defensive perimeter that had suddenly grown. The wall that had faced only the sea now faced an active fleet. He spread his soldiers thin, and the lines grew thin with them. On the night of the 28th of May, the citizens of Constantinople gathered inside the Hagia Sophia for what everyone understood might be the last time. Greek and Latin Christians, whose churches had been formally in schism for 4 centuries, whose theological differences had prevented any real military alliance against the Ottomans for 50 years, prayed together in the great cathedral in the hours before the final assault. The ancient mosaics glittered above them in the lamplight. Christ in the dome, the Virgin in the apse, the emperors of 1,000 years rendered in gold. Now soldiers who had been fighting for weeks without adequate sleep knelt beside the citizens they were defending. The emperor received communion and spent the rest of the night moving along the walls. The assault began before dawn on the 29th. The irregular troops came first, wave after wave of them, testing the walls, exhausting the defenders, drawing fire. Then, in the gray of early morning, the Janissaries came. They struck the section of wall where the Genoese commander had been wounded and carried from his post, where the defense had thinned. They found a small gate in the outer wall that had been left unlocked, whether by accident or treachery the sources have never resolved, and pushed through it. The outer wall was breached. The inner wall held for another hour. Then, it did not. The emperor was last seen at the breach in the wall of the Blachernae district. He had removed his imperial regalia, the purple robe, the insignia that identified him as the successor of Constantine the Great and, by Byzantine reasoning, of the Roman Caesars, and was fighting in the breach in a plain tunic and the red leather boots that were the one mark of imperial rank he kept. His body was never definitively identified. A head was later presented to the Sultan as proof of his death. Whether it was actually the emperor's, no one could say. He died among his people in the walls of the city his ancestor had built, at the end of a civilization that had endured for 1,500 years. The Sultan entered Constantinople 3 days later, riding through streets that his soldiers were still looting. He went first to the Hagia Sophia. He stopped in the doorway, dismounted, bent down, and picked up a handful of earth, which he poured over his turban, a gesture of humility before God, performed at the threshold of a building whose size and beauty had moved visitors to speechlessness for 900 years. Then he walked inside, ordered a muezzin to the upper gallery, and listened to the call to prayer echo through the dome where the Byzantine emperors had been crowned. He was 21 years old. He called himself afterward the Kaiser-i-Rum, the Caesar of the Romans. He meant it seriously. He was not only the heir of the Ottoman frontier lords who had taken Bithynia from the Byzantines a century and a half before. He was, in his own understanding, the successor of the Roman Empire. It's the legitimate inheritor of the tradition that had run from Augustus through Constantine through the 1,000 years of Byzantine continuity. The Ottoman Empire in this accounting was not the destroyer of Rome, it was its continuation. That was 1453. What came after was not consolidation, it was acceleration. The sultans who followed pushed in every direction simultaneously. Into the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania absorbed in the decades after the fall. Into the Black Sea, the Crimea taken, the grain ports controlled. The Mediterranean changed character as Ottoman fleets, built in the shipyard established on the Golden Horn within 2 years of the conquest, challenged the Venetian and Genoese dominance of the eastern sea lanes. By 1480, an Ottoman army had landed in southern Italy. The Pope issued a call for crusade. The army withdrew when its commander died, but the landing had happened, and every Christian ruler in Europe understood what it meant. Then came the Sultan, whose reign lasted only 8 years and whose legacy is almost impossible to overstate. He was Suleiman's father, known to his own people as Yavuz, the Resolute, known in European accounts as the Grim. He came to power in 1512 and died in 1520, and in those 8 years he expanded the empire's territory by 70%. He moved east first, crushing the Safavid Persian cavalry at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 with a tactical formula that had become the Ottoman signature. Janissary infantry, with firearms holding the center, artillery destroying the cavalry charges before they could close. The Persians were proud of their horsemen. They disdained firearms as unworthy of warriors. At Chaldiran, the firearms killed them by the thousands before a sword was drawn. Then he turned south. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had governed Egypt and Syria for 2.5 centuries, which had stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut when no other power could, which controlled the pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina, fell in a single year-long campaign. Syria fell first at a battle near Aleppo in August 1516. Damascus submitted weeks later. The Ottoman army crossed the Sinai Desert with thousands of camels carrying water, artillery, and supplies. Egypt fell in January 1517 outside the gates of Cairo. The last Mamluk sultan was captured and hanged at the city gate. In Cairo, and the sultan took possession of the prophet's mantle and sword, the relics that symbolized the leadership of the Muslim world, and had them transported to Istanbul. The Caliphate, the spiritual office of successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the same title whose holder had been wrapped in a carpet and trampled in Baghdad in 1258, passed to the Ottoman dynasty. It would remain there until 1924. On the eve of his death in 1520, The empire covered 3.4 million square kilometers. For the first time since the height of Rome, the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Mediterranean were all governed by a single power. Not since the height of the Roman Empire had the known world been held so completely by one hand. His son inherited all of it at the age of 25. He also inherited the question that the empire's size made unavoidable. What kind of state was this, and what would it cost to keep it? The answer to that question, the contradictions it exposed, the choices it forced, the specific human wreckage it produced, is what the next part of this story is about. When Suleiman inherited the empire in September 1520, his father had left him the most powerful state in the world. He was 25 years old. The treasury was full. The army was undefeated. The administration that the Devshirme had built over 2 centuries was running with the precision of a machine that had been calibrated by 4 generations of capable sultans. He had no internal rivals. His father had ensured that systematically before he died. His first 2 decisions as sultan were to release 1,500 prisoners his father had taken from Egypt and Persia, and to compensate the merchants whose goods his father had confiscated during his campaigns. These were deliberate signals. He was telling the empire and the world what kind of sultan he intended to be. He intended to be a just one. The Europeans called him Suleiman the Magnificent because what they saw was the armies, the conquests, the gold. His own people called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. In the first years of his reign, he undertook a systematic reform of Ottoman law, trying to rationalize the relationship between Islamic Sharia and the customary law that had accumulated across the empire's different territories. He wanted the empire to be governed by principle, and not by the accumulated habits of whoever happened to be administering each province. He kept a diary throughout his campaigns, 13 of them over 46 years, the details of the first 8 recorded in his own hand. A sultan who wrote down what he saw and what he decided. A man who understood his own place in history and was watching himself occupy it. In the first 6 years of his reign, he took Belgrade and Rhodes. In 1526, his army destroyed the Hungarian kingdom at the Battle of Mohatz in 90 minutes. The Hungarian king drowned in a marsh fleeing the field, and the Ottoman army lost 1,500 men against 20,000 Hungarian dead. Hungary as an independent state ceased to exist that afternoon. 3 years later, in 1529, he stood before the walls of Vienna with the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. Vienna held. The siege lasted 3 weeks before the autumn rains, and the extended supply lines forced Suleiman to withdraw. He came back in 1532 and turned back again before he reached the city. Vienna was the westernmost point the Ottoman army ever reached, and its failure to fall was the moment that fixed the western boundary of Ottoman expansion permanently. Suleiman spent the rest of his reign pressing against that boundary without breaking it. To the east and south, he had more success. He took Iraq from Persia, giving the empire access to the Persian Gulf. His navy, under the command of an admiral the Europeans called Barbarossa, won a decisive battle off the Greek coast in 1538 that gave the Ottomans naval dominance over the Mediterranean for 3 decades. North Africa, as far west as Algeria, came under Ottoman suzerainty. The great Islamic cities, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, were all, by the middle of his reign, under the Sultan's authority. By 1550, Suleiman governed somewhere between 15 and 25 million people across 3 continents. The empire ran from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. Most of the great cities of the Islamic world answered to Istanbul. The Suleymaniye mosque complex his architect had been building on the 3rd hill of the city since 1550. Its dome visible from the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, its foundation endowment supporting 4 madrasas, a hospital, a soup kitchen, a caravanserai, and a primary school, was the physical expression of what the empire had become under his hand. He was, by any measurement available to the 16th century, the most powerful ruler alive. And inside his own palace, something had been building for 20 years that would end with the death of his son and the beginning of the empire's long unraveling. Her name before the harem was Alexandra. She was taken during a Tatar slave raid on a village in what is now western Ukraine, the daughter of a Ruthenian Orthodox priest sometime around 1520, the same year Suleiman became sultan. She arrived in Constantinople with reddish-blonde hair and a temperament that made her immediately difficult to manage. She refused to follow the harem's established rules. When she was punished for it, she did not cry. And the other women had been trained in the arts of patience and compliance. She had not been trained at all. She was renamed Hurrem, the joyful one, by the Sultan himself. She bore Suleiman his first son in 1521, 1 year after arriving. The harem's custom was that a concubine who had borne a son did not seek the Sultan's company again. Hurrem sought it repeatedly. She bore him 6 children in roughly 10 years. Each additional child was a violation of the convention designed to prevent any single woman from concentrating too much influence in her hands. Then, Suleiman freed her, married her, legally, publicly, in a ceremony that the court witnessed, and the Venetian ambassador reported back to Venice with open bewilderment. He made a former slave his wife and his legal consort. The reaction inside the palace was immediate. A concubine who had previously outranked Hurrem spat at her in a corridor. "Sold meat," she said. In Venice, the ambassador wrote that the Sultan had been bewitched. The Grand Vizier, Suleiman's childhood friend and the most powerful administrator in the empire not occupied by the Sultan himself, looked at the woman his Sultan had married and understood the calculation she was making. He was right to understand it. By 1536 he was dead, strangled in the palace on Suleiman's orders after a dinner at which the Sultan had been his host. The exact charge against him has never been established. What is not in dispute is the context. The most powerful man in the empire outside the Sultan had accumulated enough independent authority to constitute a threat, and Hurrem had spent years ensuring that Suleiman saw it that way. The position of Grand Vizier passed, in time, to a man who had married Hurrem's daughter. The court's center of gravity had shifted. All of this was preparation. The object was the throne. Suleiman had sons by 2 women. Mustafa, born around 1515 to an earlier concubine, was the eldest. He had served as governor of Manisa, then of Amasya. He had commanded armies. By 1553 he was 37 or 38 years old, experienced, capable, admired by the Janissaries, liked by the provincial soldiers who had served under him, regarded by almost everyone outside the harem as the obvious and natural successor to his father. His popularity was the kind that could not be manufactured. It had been earned across 2 decades of competent provincial administration and genuine military service. Hurrem's sons were Selim and Bayezid. Neither of them commanded the respect that Mustafa did. As long as Mustafa lived, she knew, neither of her sons could be sultan. The logic was plain, and the method was the question. The method chosen was a forgery and a whisper campaign. The new Grand Vizier, her son-in-law, began, sometime around 1552, circulating a story through the army during Suleiman's Persian campaign. The story was that the soldiers were restless, that they believed Suleiman, now approaching 60, should step aside for a younger man, that Mustafa had been approached with this suggestion and had not refused it. The story was delivered to Suleiman through sources he trusted, in the voice of men whose loyalty he had never questioned. Simultaneously, a letter appeared, its origins disputed, and its authenticity never established, appearing to show Mustafa in communication with the Persian enemy. Treason, during an active campaign, was an accusation that required only plausibility to be fatal. Mustafa's advisors told him not to go to his father's tent when the summons came. They told him the summons was a trap. Mustafa's mother, who had left the capital to accompany her son in his provincial posting, told him the same thing. The Habsburg ambassador, observing from a distance, recorded the dilemma with precision. If Mustafa went and the Sultan believed the accusations, he would die. If Mustafa stayed and kept his army in the field, he would be confirming the charge of rebellion. The trap had no exit that left him alive. He went. He rode into the Ottoman camp at Areli in October 1553, and on the assumption that a son could face his father and be believed. He entered the inner chamber of the Sultan's tent. The men who had accompanied him were held outside. Inside the tent, the executioners were already positioned. Mustafa fought them. Every source agrees on this, that he did not submit without resistance. But he was alone, and his father was behind a curtain throughout, close enough to hear what was happening, and did not intervene. When it was over, the body of Suleiman's eldest son was brought outside and displayed in front of the tent, so that the army could see it. The Janissaries wept. Then they were furious. The provincial soldiers who had served under Mustafa grieved openly and did not disguise their anger. Across Anatolia, the reaction was so widespread that people began calling him Sultan Mustafa, as if he had already reigned and been taken from them. A poet composed an elegy that circulated through the empire. The Grand Vizier was dismissed from his post as a gesture toward the army's anger. He was reinstated within a year. Mustafa's young sons were executed in the months that followed. Every potential rallying point for opposition was closed. Hürrem died in 1558, 5 years after Mustafa and 5 years before Suleiman. She was buried in a mausoleum attached to the Suleymaniye Mosque, the building that Suleiman had commissioned at the height of his power, that still stands above Istanbul as the most complete monument to what his reign achieved. Her tomb is beside his. She had arrived without a name, in chains, the daughter of a village priest. She left as the woman whose son inherited the Ottoman dynasty. Suleiman died in September 1566 in a tent on campaign in Hungary at the age of 71. He had been suffering from gout severe enough that he was carried on a litter for much of the march. He died before the Hungarian fortress his army was besieging had fallen. The Grand Vizier, who had replaced the one Hürrem had destroyed. The same man who had once been a Serbian boy taken by the Devshirme, whose mother had recognized him by a birthmark, kept the Sultan's death secret for 48 days, managing the army's loyalty and the transfer of power until the succession was secured. Suleiman was buried in Istanbul, in the mausoleum beside the mosque that bears his name, beside the woman he had married against every convention of his civilization. His reign had produced the Suleymaniye Mosque, the codification of Ottoman law, the naval dominance of the Mediterranean, the conquest of Hungary, Iraq, and North Africa, and the furthest western advance in Ottoman history. It had also produced the death of the man best qualified to lead the empire after him, engineered by the woman Suleiman had chosen over every precedent his own civilization offered, through the instruments of a system that had placed no check between a sultan's will and its consequences. The empire that Suleiman's son inherited in 1566 was, in territory and revenue, the most powerful state in the world. It was also governed by a man the Janissaries referred to, in private, as Selim the Drunkard, and it contained within its own military structure a force that had spent 200 years accumulating the power to make or unmake sultans. The next part of this story belongs to them. The Janissaries who wept for Mustafa outside Suleiman's tent in 1553 were, at that moment, the most formidable infantry force in the world. Taken as children, trained for decades, loyal to no family and no tribal lord, armed with firearms before most European armies had fully committed to them, They had broken the walls of Constantinople, shattered the Hungarian kingdom in 90 minutes at Mohacs, and driven the Ottoman frontier to the gates of Vienna. For 2 centuries, they had been exactly what the Devshirme was designed to produce, a military class with no roots except the empire itself. By 1826, they were something else entirely. Now, their numbers had grown from roughly 1,000 men in the 14th century to 135,000 by the time the end came. But growth in numbers had not meant growth in capability. Recruitment standards had collapsed a century earlier, when the rule forbidding Janissaries to marry was quietly abandoned, and the sons of Janissaries began inheriting their fathers' positions rather than being selected through the Devshirme. Turkish-born civilians paid for enrollment in the corps, lured by the salary, the tax exemptions, and the social status. Many of the men drawing Janissary pay in the 19th century had never been on campaign. Some of them had never held a military weapon. They were craftsmen, shopkeepers, coffeehouse owners, men who belonged to the corps on paper and collected their stipends with the same regularity that a pensioner collects a pension. The military that had once terrified Europe had become, in the most precise sense, a protection racket. How this happened is not mysterious. The Janissaries had always been, in addition to a military force, a political one. The Devshirme had been designed to produce soldiers with no loyalties except to the Sultan. What it had actually produced over 2 centuries of shared barracks and shared campaigns and the particular intimacy of men who live and fight together for decades was a corps with fierce loyalties to each other. Their unit cohesion, which made them devastating in battle, and also made them capable of collective action against anyone who threatened their interests, including sultans. The signal that the balance had shifted came in stages. From the reign of one sultan in the late 15th century onward, the Janissaries began requiring that each new sultan pay a ceremonial bonus to the corps upon his accession. The bonus was called the kulis bashishi, the accession gift. It was presented as a voluntary expression of imperial generosity. It was, in practice, a toll. A sultan who refused to pay it was a sultan who did not feel secure on his throne, and a sultan who paid it had acknowledged, in a way that everyone understood, that his security depended on the corps' goodwill. From there, the trajectory was consistent. Sultans who proposed reforms that threatened Janissary pay, Janissary privileges, or Janissary influence overturned their soup cauldrons, the traditional signal of revolt, and marched on the palace. 6 sultans were removed from the Ottoman throne by Janissary action, either deposed or killed. One sultan, in the early 17th century, was executed by the Janissaries after attempting to cut their pay. The corps had been designed as the sultan's instrument. Over 2 centuries, it had transformed itself into the sultan's constraint. The Ottoman word for the Janissary revolt signal was telling in itself. Overturning the kazan, the great communal cooking pot around which the corps organized its daily life, was the act that announced rebellion. The Janissaries ate together, slept together, drilled together, organized their social world around the shared meal. The pot was not just a cooking vessel. It was a symbol of the corps' collective identity, the physical object that represented everything the Devshirme had built, men without families, whose family was each other. When they turned it over, they were saying that the Sultan had broken faith with that family. The sultans learned to watch the cauldrons. By the early 19th century, the situation had become structurally absurd. The empire was losing wars it had once won effortlessly. Russian pressure from the north had been grinding away at Ottoman territory since the late 18th century. Serbian rebels had been fighting for autonomy since 1804. Greek independence fighters had been at war with Ottoman forces since 1821. Chisin, the Janissaries sent to suppress them, had performed so poorly that the Sultan had been forced to request military assistance from his own nominal vassal in Egypt, a humiliation with no precedent in Ottoman history. The Janissaries knew they were militarily obsolete. They also knew that any genuine military reform would end their privileges, their pay, their tax exemptions, their coffee houses, their trades, their entire social world. So they opposed every reform with the same collective ferocity that had once made them the finest infantry in the world, and directed it instead at any Ottoman official who suggested changing the army. The Sultan, who came to power in 1808, understood all of this with unusual clarity. He had watched the Janissaries dethrone his predecessor. The previous Sultan had been deposed and later killed after attempting military reforms. He had no illusions about what he was dealing with. He spent 18 years preparing. He co-opted the religious establishment first, bringing the senior Islamic scholars into a new governmental department that gave them a stake in the imperial administration, and quietly separated them from the Janissaries, who had always relied on religious legitimacy as a shield. He publicized Janissary abuses systematically, building a case in the court of public opinion in Istanbul, so that when the time came, the urban population of the capital would not rise to defend the cause. He created a new artillery unit, trained in European methods, housed separately from the Janissary barracks. And he did this gradually, framing it as a support force rather than a replacement army, so the Janissaries would not feel threatened until it was too late. In May 1826, he announced a new military regulation requiring Janissaries to participate in regular training drills in the European style. It was a modest proposal by any objective measure. He had chosen it deliberately because it was modest, because rejecting it would reveal the core for what it had become, a vested interest dressed in military clothing and not a fighting force at all. The Janissaries overturned their cauldrons on June 14, 1826. The Sultan had been waiting for exactly this. He brought out the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad from the imperial treasury, the same relic his ancestor had carried from Cairo after the conquest of Egypt 3 centuries earlier, and had it unfurled in the Hippodrome. The proclamation that accompanied it declared that all true believers were called to defend the faith against the rebels. The religious establishment, which the Sultan had spent years carefully cultivating, issued the necessary endorsements. The population of Istanbul, which had suffered under Janissary extortion and intimidation for generations, came out in numbers that surprised even the Sultan's own commanders. The Janissary barracks at Et Meydana were surrounded by artillery. The guns opened fire. Incendiary rounds set the vast wooden buildings alight. The barracks burned with the men inside them. Those who escaped into the streets of Istanbul were hunted by cavalry and by the city's own residents. The rebellion lasted less than 3 hours. 4,000 Janissaries died in the barracks. Thousands more were killed in the streets, executed in the days that followed, or sent to the fortress at Thessaloniki, which was called the Blood Tower, before it was renamed the White Tower, where the surviving prisoners were put to death by decapitation before the year was out. The Sultan issued a decree the following day abolishing the Janissary Corps. He ordered the destruction of their regimental cauldrons. He prohibited any future reference to them by name. The Bektashi Sufi Brotherhood, which had served as the Corps' spiritual institution for 4 centuries, was outlawed. Its followers were executed or exiled. In one day, as the institutional structure that had existed since the 14th century was dismantled, the Sultan called the event the Vaka-i Hayriye, the auspicious incident. In the Balkans, where Janissary communities had deep roots, and the destruction of the Corps threw Muslim convert communities into sudden vulnerability, it was called by another name, the unfortunate incident. What the Sultan had destroyed was a military institution. What he had also destroyed, though this was less visible at the time, was something more complicated. By 1826, the Janissaries were embedded in the economic and social fabric of Ottoman cities in ways that went far beyond the barracks. They ran coffee houses. They owned workshops. They provided informal protection to craft guilds that operated under their patronage. They were, In the cities where they were most concentrated, the institutional face of the Ottoman urban working class, the artisans, the small traders, the guild members who had the most to lose from the kind of state modernization the Sultan was driving toward. Destroying the Janissaries cleared the path for military reform. It also destroyed the one organized force in Ottoman society capable of resisting the direction the empire was about to travel. Whether that force would have resisted wisely or simply repeated the pattern of obstruction it had practiced for a century is a question history did not allow to be answered. The Sultan replaced the corps with a new army trained in European methods, housed in European-style barracks, drilled by European officers. It was called the Victorious Soldiers of Muhammad. Within 3 years of the auspicious incident, the empire lost a war with Russia and surrendered territory it had held for generations. The new army performed no better in the field than the institution it had replaced. The monster was gone. The vulnerabilities that had made it powerful remained, now without even the rough containment that the corps had provided. The empire's problems had always been larger than its army. Now it had neither the old army nor the old stability, and the century that would break it was already underway. What was breaking it was an idea, a single, specific idea that the French Revolution had released into the world 40 years earlier. Iran, which was now moving through the Balkans and the Arab provinces and the Armenian highlands and every other corner of the Ottoman territory with the patient destructive force of water finding cracks in stone. The idea was nationalism. And the Ottoman Empire, which had been built on the premise that people with different gods and different languages could share the same geography, had no answer for it. The nationalism that was moving through the Balkans in the early 19th century had not originated there. It had been born in France in 1789, carried eastward by Napoleon's armies and the ideas those armies spread in their wake, and what it said, in its simplest, most powerful formulation, was this: people who share a language and a history deserve to govern themselves. It was an idea that could be ignored so long as it remained the property of philosophers. It became dangerous the moment ordinary people began to believe it. The Ottoman Empire had been built on the opposite premise. Its subjects did not need to share a language or a history. They needed to pay their taxes, keep their peace, and function within the Millet structure that organized their communal lives. The empire had held that premise for 6 centuries against every competitor. It had no framework for countering an idea that said the premise itself was wrong. The first serious test came from Serbia. In 1804, Serbian peasants in the region around Belgrade rose against their local Ottoman administrators, not initially against the empire itself, but against the specific men who had been taxing them, conscripting them, and occasionally killing them with the casual authority of officials who had stopped fearing accountability. The rebellion was local, grievance-driven, and led by a pig merchant. Within a decade, it had become a war for Serbian autonomy. Within 3 decades, Serbia had gained a degree of self-rule in 1815 and became an autonomous principality in 1830. Then, Greece. The Greek War of Independence began in 1821 and lasted 9 years. It was fought with extraordinary brutality on both sides. Massacres of Greek civilians, massacres of Ottoman garrisons, atrocities that both sides documented and neither side felt shame about. What made it different from earlier uprisings was the European response. The Greeks had classical antiquity on their side, or at least the European educated classes believed they did. Young poets and aristocrats from England and France and Germany arrived to fight for what they understood as the birthplace of Western civilization. A famous English poet died at Missolonghi in 1824 of fever, preparing to join the campaign. The romantic image of Greeks fighting for freedom against Ottoman tyranny generated a pressure on European governments that no previous Ottoman military action had produced. In 1827, the British, French, and Russian navies destroyed the combined Ottoman and Egyptian fleet at the Battle of Navarino. an intervention by the great powers of Europe in an Ottoman internal conflict that would have been unthinkable 50 years earlier. After 9 years of war, Greece was recognized as an independent state under the London Protocol of February 1830. A province of the Ottoman Empire, which had been part of the imperial system since the 15th century, was now an independent country with a Bavarian prince as its king, its borders drawn by European powers in London. The Ottoman government had watched all of this with a kind of paralysis that reflected the depth of the crisis. The military that should have suppressed the Greek revolt had been occupied with its own internal dysfunction. The Janissaries, still unreformed in 1821, had proven unable to sustain effective field operations. The provincial forces that the empire relied on in the Balkans had their own interests, which did not always align with Istanbul's. The treasury was depleted from decades of losing wars against Russia. Yes, the administrative class was divided between reformers who understood that the empire had to change, and conservatives who understood that change threatened everything they had. It was in this condition, one lost province, an army that had just humiliated the empire in Greece, a treasury under pressure, and the Janissaries still in their barracks constituting a veto over any military reform, that the Sultan who broke the Janissaries died in 1839, 12 years after the auspicious incident. He died before completing what he had started. His son, 16 years old, inherited the throne. Waiting for the new Sultan was a man who had spent the previous 4 years in London and Paris. He had been born in Istanbul in 1800, the son of a minor official, and had risen through the Ottoman bureaucracy with a speed that reflected genuine ability. Foreign minister at 37, ambassador to both France and Britain before 40. What those years in Europe had done to him was not simply expose him to European institutions. They had given him a specific, uncomfortable clarity about the distance between where the Ottoman Empire was and where it needed to be. He had sat in the drawing rooms of London, read the newspapers, watched a functioning constitutional monarchy operate, and come home to a state that was losing territories, losing wars, and losing the argument about whether it had any future at all. On the 3rd of November, 1839, in the Rose Garden of Topkapi Palace, the Gulhane, or the Garden of Roses, the new Sultan stood before an assembly that included the foreign ambassadors of every European power and read aloud an imperial edict. The man who had drafted it stood nearby. The edict was called the Hadi Sharif of Gulhane, the Noble Edict of the Rose Chamber. It promised, for the first time in Ottoman history, that all subjects of the empire, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, would have guaranteed security of life and property, equal treatment before the law, and a rational system of taxation applied without regard to religion. The assembled European ambassadors applauded. The conservative Ottoman clergy went home to write objections. The new Sultan's reforming Grand Vizier went back to work. The Tanzimat had begun. Tanzimat means reorganization. The word does not carry the weight of what was actually being attempted. Over the following 3 decades, the empire that had governed by Islamic law and imperial tradition for 6 centuries tried to remake itself into something that resembled, at least in outline, a modern European state. New secular courts were established alongside the religious ones. A new penal code was drafted, based on French models. State secondary schools were founded across the empire, teaching subjects that the old Madras system had never touched: geography, modern history, Ottoman Turkish in a standardized form. Railways were built. Telegraph lines were strung across Anatolia. The first Ottoman newspaper was founded. The first Ottoman constitution, a genuine written constitution, then establishing a parliament with elected representatives, was promulgated in 1876. Each of these things was real. Each of them was also, in ways that only became fully visible later, a source of pressure that the empire was not equipped to absorb. The secular courts were real, but the religious courts continued to exist alongside them, And in practice, non-Muslims often found that the guarantees of equality in the edict did not reliably survive contact with actual judges. The promise of equal citizenship had been made. The infrastructure to deliver it had not been built. The new schools were real, and the generation they educated became the empire's most capable administrators and military officers. They were also the generation that read European political philosophy in those schools and came home asking why the Ottoman Empire did not have the same rights as the nations they had been reading about. The schools that were supposed to produce loyal Ottoman subjects produced instead the young Ottomans, then the young Turks, men who wanted constitutional government, who wanted representative institutions, who wanted the empire to look like France or Britain, and who could not agree on whether that meant strengthening the Ottoman identity or replacing it with a Turkish one. The foreign debt was the most concrete measure of what the reforms cost. The empire had borrowed almost nothing from European banks before the Crimean War of 1853. That by 1875, it had borrowed the equivalent of £200 million sterling and was spending more than half its annual revenue servicing the debt. In 1875, it defaulted. The European creditors who held its bonds immediately began pressuring their own governments to intervene in Ottoman affairs, to protect their investments, to ensure Ottoman finances were managed with proper European oversight. The empire that had launched the Tanzimat to modernize itself had ended up financially colonized by the very powers whose approval it had been seeking. The timing was not coincidental. Each major reform announcement from the Ottoman government coincided precisely with a moment when it needed something from Europe. The 1839 edict came when the empire needed British and French help against its own Egyptian governor, who had built an autonomous military capable of threatening Istanbul. The 1856 edict, a second and more extensive reform declaration, came when the empire needed to be admitted as a recognized partner in the peace settlement after the Crimean War. The 1876 Constitution came when European pressure for Ottoman reform had reached a point where some gesture had to be made. Western observers at the time read this as hypocrisy. Ottoman reformers were not hypocrites. They were men caught between an internal conservative establishment that would resist every genuine reform and an external European audience that demanded reform as the price of diplomatic support. They made promises they could not fully keep, because making no promises at all would have cost them the only allies they had. The reformers understood perfectly well that the empire was in danger. They disagreed, sometimes bitterly, about whether the reforms were addressing the danger or merely advertising a response to it. The man who drafted the Gülhane Edict served as Grand Vizier 6 separate times between 1845 and 1857, dismissed and reinstated in cycles that reflected the factional politics of the palace rather than any assessment of his performance. He died in 1858, having spent 18 years trying to build a modern state inside an institution that kept dismantling what he built. His reforms outlasted him. The debt also outlasted him. While the empire was reforming its courts and building its railways, the Balkans were leaving. Serbia had its autonomy. Greece had its independence. Now, Bulgaria was moving. The Bulgarian national movement initially concentrated on peaceful struggle for cultural and religious autonomy, resulting in the establishment of a separate Bulgarian church, the Bulgarian Exarchate, in 1870. The creation of that church was itself a wound to the Millet system. The Greek patriarch, who under the Ottoman framework had governed all Orthodox Christians regardless of language, suddenly found his authority challenged by a competing institution organized on ethnic rather than religious lines. The Millet had been built on religion as the organizing principle of communal identity. Nationalism organized identity around language and ethnicity. The two systems were incompatible, and nationalism was winning. In April 1876, Bulgarian rebels in several districts of the Balkans rose in armed revolt. The Ottoman response was swift and savage. Irregular cavalry units moved through Bulgarian villages with a violence that produced, within weeks, accounts reaching European newspapers. The massacre at Batak, where somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 civilians were killed in a single village, was reported in the British press in enough detail that the British public reaction forced a political crisis in London. The Bulgarian Horrors, they were called. The leader of the British opposition published a pamphlet demanding that the Turks remove themselves from the region, bag and baggage, he wrote, that sold 40,000 copies in its first few days. The Ottoman Empire had been committing acts of comparable violence in comparable circumstances for decades. What had changed was the telegraph and the newspaper. And the European public that had been reading, since 1821, a narrative of Christian populations suffering under Muslim rule, a narrative that the Millet system's actual history complicated considerably, but that the Bulgarian massacres of 1876 seemed to confirm with immediate force. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1877. The war lasted less than a year. The Russian army advanced to within sight of Istanbul before a European diplomatic intervention forced a settlement. The resulting Treaty of Berlin in 1878 recognized the independence of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro, and created a largely autonomous Bulgaria. The Ottoman Empire had lost, in the space of 50 years, most of what it held in Europe. Inside Istanbul, the response to this cascade of loss produced three distinct intellectual movements, that each one a different attempt to answer the same question: what is the Ottoman Empire, and who does it belong to? The first answer was Pan-Ottomanism. The empire's educated reformers argued that the solution was a genuine civic identity, that the word Ottoman should mean something, that Muslim and Christian and Jewish subjects should have the same rights and feel the same loyalty, that the empire could survive as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state if it gave its subjects reason to remain. The Constitution of 1876 was the fullest expression of this idea. It lasted 14 months. The new sultan suspended it in 1878, citing the emergency of the Russian War, and did not convene parliament again for 30 years. The second answer was Pan-Islamism. If civic Ottoman identity could not hold the empire together, perhaps Islamic solidarity could. The sultan who suspended the constitution turned in the following decades to positioning himself as the caliph, the spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims, not just Ottoman subjects. He cultivated relationships with Muslim communities in British India, in Russian Central Asia, in Dutch Indonesia, presenting himself as the defender of Islam against European imperialism. It was a genuinely creative strategy. It also addressed none of the empire's structural problems, and the Muslim populations it was meant to mobilize were, on the whole, too far away to help. The third answer was Pan-Turkism. If the empire could not survive as an Ottoman entity or as an Islamic one, perhaps it could survive as a Turkish one, organized around the Turkish language and Turkish ethnic identity. Yet the way Greece was organized around Greek identity and Serbia around Serbian. Pan-Turkism was, in its origins, a movement of intellectuals in the 1880s and 1890s. It would become in the hands of a new generation of military officers who seized power in 1908, the ideology of the empire's last decade. The Young Turks, as they were called, formerly the Committee of Union and Progress, came to power promising a return to constitutional government, an end to the Sultan's autocracy, and the reinstatement of the 1876 Parliament. They delivered on those promises. They also, in the following years, made a series of decisions about what the empire was and who it was for that would produce, in the Armenian highlands to the east, the darkest chapter in Ottoman history. That chapter requires its own telling. What the Young Turks had inherited when they took power in 1908 was an empire that had spent a century losing. Lost provinces, lost wars, lost revenue, lost prestige. The reformers and constitutionalists among them genuinely believed they could reverse the trajectory. that modern institutions, a functioning parliament, rational administration, and a renewed sense of Ottoman civic identity could hold what remained of the empire together. They had reinstated the constitution. They had convened parliament. They had, for a moment, seemed to represent something new. The moment did not last. By 1913, the three men who would govern the empire through the First World War had seized effective control through a coup inside the Young Turk movement. They were the interior minister, the war minister, and the navy minister, a triumvirate who had concluded in the wreckage of the Balkan Wars, in which the empire had lost nearly everything it still held in Europe, that the empire's survival required a more radical solution than constitutional reform. The solution they reached for was ethnic homogeneity. Turkey for the Turks. An Anatolia cleared of the communities that had lived inside it for centuries, reorganized around a single language and a single identity, stripped of its minorities by whatever means the war made available. The Armenians were the largest Christian population remaining in Anatolia. They had been there for 3,000 years. The relationship between the Ottoman state and its Armenian community had been deteriorating for decades before 1915. In the 1890s, a series of massacres had killed somewhere between 80,000 and 300,000 Armenians across eastern Anatolia, ordered by the Sultan, who had spent 30 years suspending constitutions and building an autocracy on pan-Islamic solidarity. Those massacres had drawn international condemnation and produced nothing. No intervention, no accountability, no change in Ottoman policy. The lesson the Young Turks absorbed from this was not that massacres were wrong. It was that massacres could be committed against minorities without serious international consequence. The First World War provided cover. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war in November 1914 on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the triumvirate had the conditions they needed: wartime emergency powers, foreign attention directed elsewhere, and an official pretext, the claim that Armenian communities in eastern Anatolia posed a security threat as potential collaborators with the Russian enemy pressing from the north. The pretext was manufactured. In the eastern province of Van, Armenians had indeed taken up arms in April 1915. In response to orders from the local governor to surrender their weapons, an order they understood correctly as preparation for the massacres that had already begun in surrounding villages. Their resistance at Van was self-defense. It was presented to Istanbul and to the outside world as proof of Armenian treachery. On the 24th of April, 1915, a date that Armenians around the world still mark each year as the beginning of the genocide, the interior minister ordered the arrest and deportation of several hundred Armenian intellectuals, community leaders and politicians from Istanbul. Most of them were dead within months. That was the first phase. It removed the people capable of organizing resistance or articulating what was happening to the outside world. What followed was systematic. Armenian men of military age had already been conscripted into the Ottoman army. In the weeks after April 1915, they were disarmed, separated into unarmed labor battalions, and in most cases, executed, shot in small groups in the countryside, or worked to death on roads and fortifications. With the men gone, the deportations of the remaining population began in May. The Ottoman Parliament passed a formal law authorizing the deportations on the 30th of May, 1915. It was presented as a wartime security measure. It applied not only to the border provinces near Russia, but now within weeks to Armenian communities throughout the empire in places hundreds of miles from any front line. The convoys were driven south and east toward the Syrian desert. They were given no food and no water for the journey. They were escorted by gendarmes who offered no protection and in many cases participated in the violence inflicted on the column by irregular bands that rode alongside. Bands that had in many cases been specifically organized for this purpose, recruited from prisons, operating under government authorization. The women and children who survived the marches arrived, months later, at concentration camps in the desert near Deir ez-Zor in what is now eastern Syria. Most of those who reached the camps died there. The American ambassador in Istanbul watched all of this from the capital. He was a German-born Jewish lawyer from New York, appointed to his post 2 years before the war began, a man who had come to the Ottoman Empire with no particular brief regarding its minorities and who found himself, within months of April 1915, sitting across a table from the interior minister discussing the murder of a people. He wrote in his memoir, published 3 years later, that the minister made no particular attempt to conceal what was happening. The deportations, the minister told him, were necessary. The ambassador asked why women, children, and old people were being deported alongside anyone who might conceivably pose a security threat. The minister's answer was direct. The innocents of today, he said, would be the guilty of tomorrow. The ambassador cabled Washington repeatedly. He told his government that a campaign of race extermination was in progress. Those were his exact words, sent on the 16th of July, 1915, in an official diplomatic cable. Washington expressed concern. No intervention followed. The United States was not yet in the war. The interior minister, when the ambassador pressed him, told him the Ottoman-Armenian policy was absolutely fixed and that nothing would change it. By the end of 1915, Armenian existence in eastern Anatolia had been effectively extinguished. The region that had been the Armenian homeland for 3,000 years, the highlands between the Black Sea, the Caspian, and the mountains of eastern Turkey, was empty of Armenians. Their churches stood open to the sky. Their schools had been burned or converted. Their property had been distributed to Muslim settlers. And the communities that the Millet had recognized, administered, and taxed for 4 centuries were gone. The numbers historians have established, working from Ottoman records, German diplomatic cables, American consular reports, and survivor testimony, range from 600,000 to 1.5 million dead. The variation in the estimate reflects the difficulty of counting the dead in a desert across a year and a half of organized killing. It does not reflect any serious dispute among historians about what happened or what it was. The overwhelming consensus of genocide scholars, the formal positions of the governments of France, Germany, the United States, and dozens of other countries, and the judgments of the Ottoman military tribunals that tried some of the perpetrators after the war, all of these converge on the same word: genocide, the deliberate destruction of a people. The Turkish state has never formally accepted this designation. This is a fact about present-day Turkish politics, not a fact about what happened in 1915. The historical record is not genuinely contested among scholars. The interior minister's own words, recorded by a diplomat whose dispatches corroborate his memoir, describe the intent clearly enough that no interpretive charity is required. The genocide did not occur because the Ottoman system had always been murderous toward its minorities. It occurred because the system had broken down. The Millet that had sheltered Jews expelled from Spain, that had preserved the Greek Orthodox Church through the fall of Constantinople, that had allowed Armenians to build their own institutions and conduct their own commerce for 4 centuries. That system had operated on the premise that difference could be administered, that communities with separate identities could coexist under the same sovereign authority without destroying each other. The Young Turks had abandoned that premise. They had decided, in the ruins of an empire that was losing its multi-ethnic character province by province, that the solution to ethnic diversity was its elimination. The Millet's final act, in this sense, was its own negation. The empire that had once been the destination for peoples expelled by more homogeneous states became, in its last years, the perpetrator of the very thing it had once offered refuge from. The ambassador left Istanbul in 1916, yet exhausted and defeated by his failure to stop what he had watched happening. He spent the remaining decades of his life telling people what he had seen. He called it, in his memoir, the greatest crime of the ages. He wrote those words before the Second World War. He could not have known that the methods developed in the Syrian desert in 1915, the use of deportation as a mechanism of mass death, the organization of killing through state bureaucracy, the legal framework of emergency powers applied to eliminate an entire population, would be studied, refined, and applied again within a generation on a larger scale in Europe. The darkness in this section of Ottoman history is not the story of an empire that was always cruel. It is the story of what a state does when it has decided that its survival requires the destruction of the people it was built to govern. That decision was made by specific men for specific reasons in specific circumstances. It was not inevitable. And the fact that it happened inside an empire that had, for centuries, done the opposite, that is the part that should stay with you. What came after was the empire's final collapse and the drawing of the borders that the world has been living with ever since. On the 30th of October 1918, an Ottoman delegation boarded a British warship anchored in the harbor of the Greek island of Lemnos and signed an armistice. The ship was HMS Agamemnon. Lemnos had been the staging ground for the Allied invasion of Gallipoli 3 years earlier, the campaign where Ottoman forces had stopped a British and Australian assault on the Dardanelles in one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a victory so improbable that it had briefly given the empire's leadership the illusion that the war might still be won. Now, the men who had commanded that defense sent a delegation to the same island to surrender. The terms were comprehensive. The Ottoman army was to be demobilized. The Bosphorus and the Dardanelles were to be opened to Allied warships and their fortifications occupied. All ports, railways, and telegraph lines were made available to Allied forces. The garrisons that the empire still maintained outside Anatolia, in Yemen, in the Hejaz, in Mesopotamia, were to surrender to local Allied commanders. The armistice, in effect, placed the physical infrastructure of the Ottoman Empire under Allied control, not yet partition, not yet the final map. But the empire that had once turned back the largest fleet in the world at Gallipoli was now signing documents aboard a British battleship, and the men who had governed it through the war were already gone. The interior minister, the man who had told the American ambassador that the innocents of today would be the guilty of tomorrow, the man who had organized the deportations, the man whose name appears in every serious historical account of the Armenian Genocide as the individual most responsible for its planning and execution, resigned from government on October 8th. He had personally witnessed the capitulation of Bulgaria, the empire's last ally with a functioning land corridor to Germany. He understood immediately what it meant. He resigned, gathered what he could carry, and fled Istanbul 3 weeks before the armistice was signed aboard a German submarine with 2 other members of the triumvirate that had governed the empire through 4 years of war and destruction. He made his way to Berlin. In March 1921, walking on a street in the Charlottenburg district, he was shot and killed by a young Armenian man whose family had been killed in the deportations. The killing was not random. It was the product of a coordinated operation planned and funded by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation that had been tracking the men responsible for the genocide across Europe and the Middle East since the war ended. The operation was called Nemesis, after the Greek goddess of retributive justice. Of the principal architects of the genocide, most were killed by it. The interior minister was its most prominent target. He died on a Berlin street 3 years after the empire he had helped destroy signed its armistice on a ship named for a character from the Trojan War. In Istanbul, the Allied occupation began in November 1918. British, French, Italian, and Greek soldiers moved through the streets of a city that had been conquered once before in 1453 and had not seen foreign soldiers in its streets since. The Sultan who remained on the throne was a ceremonial figure by this point, his authority extending no further than the palace walls. The Ottoman Parliament, which had been suspended by the war and reconvened after the armistice, passed a resolution condemning the Young Turk leadership and their wartime policies. Military tribunals were established to try the organizers of the Armenian deportations. Some were convicted and sentenced to death in absentia. They had already fled. A handful of lower-level officials were executed. Then the final insult arrived. In May 1919, Greek troops landed at Izmir on the Aegean coast of Anatolia. They had come under Allied authorization to occupy the region that the peace settlement was proposing to award to Greece. The landing was accompanied by violence against the Turkish civilian population of the city. News of it reached Istanbul within days. In a barracks on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, a former Ottoman military officer who had spent the war years in relative obscurity and too far from the centers of power to have been responsible for the disasters the empire had accumulated, began organizing. He had fought at Gallipoli. He had watched the empire lose a war, lose its territories, lose the government's credibility, lose the peace. When he sailed for the Black Sea town of Samsun in May 1919, nominally on an inspection mission authorized by the occupation authorities, who had not yet understood what he was doing, he was carrying in his luggage the beginnings of a national resistance movement. His name was Mustafa Kemal. Within 4 years, fighting a war against Greek, French, Armenian, and British-backed forces simultaneously, he would expel the occupying armies from Anatolia, abolish the Sultanate, abolish the Caliphate, and establish the Republic of Turkey on the 29th of October, 1923. The date was chosen deliberately, the anniversary of nothing in particular, a clean break, a new calendar. The Ottoman Empire was formally over. While Mustafa Kemal was fighting his war of independence, the British and French were drawing lines on maps. They had been drawing them since 1916, when 2 mid-level diplomats, one British, one French, had divided the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories between their governments in a secret agreement negotiated in London. The British diplomat was a baronet and member of Parliament with a particular interest in Middle Eastern affairs. The French diplomat was a former consul in Beirut. Working with a chinograph pencil on a map of the region, they drew lines that assigned Syria and Lebanon to France and Mesopotamia and Palestine to Britain. The lines were adjusted in the years that followed. Through the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 and the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, and through a conference in Cairo in 1921, where the colonial secretary of Britain gathered a group of advisors and redrew the map of the British mandates in a week of meetings in a hotel. Iraq was created by combining 3 Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, that had never previously formed a single administrative unit. Mosul was majority Kurdish in its northern districts, majority Sunni Arab in its center, majority Shia Arab in its south. The borders that enclosed them in a single country made administrative sense from the perspective of British oil interests and strategic access to the Persian Gulf. They made no sense at all in terms of the populations they enclosed, who had been organized by the Ottoman Millet system, not by geography, but by religion and community, and who found themselves suddenly required to be citizens of a country called Iraq, governed by a Hashemite prince imported from Arabia, under the supervision of a British mandatory power that had promised them independence and delivered administration. Syria was created from the inland territories of what had been Greater Syria, after France expelled the Arab government that had briefly established itself in Damascus. Lebanon was carved out of Syria's western coast to create a state with a Christian majority, an act of French imperial patronage toward the Maronite Christian community, whose confessional system of government, enshrined in the French-designed Lebanese constitution, would distributed political offices by religious community and has produced a state of managed dysfunction ever since. Palestine was placed under British mandatory control with a promise, delivered in a letter from the British Foreign Secretary to the leader of the Zionist Federation in November 1917, to view with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. The Kurds, who had been promised a homeland in the Treaty of Sèvres, received nothing in the Treaty of Lausanne. They were divided between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, where they remain today. The largest ethnic group in the world without a state of their own, a condition that produces active armed conflict in at least 2 of those 4 countries in any given decade. The Ottoman Empire at its height had governed all of this territory under a single administrative roof, imperfectly, unequally, with violence when it judged violence necessary, with genuine tolerance when tolerance was cheaper than suppression. The Millet had allowed Armenians to be Armenians, Greeks to be Greeks, Jews to be Jews, Kurds to be Kurds, Arabs to be Arabs, all within the same political structure. The structure had been breaking for a century before it finally broke, but it had held against considerable odds for 6 centuries, and the geography it had held together did not become more peaceful when it was replaced. Iraq has not known a decade of genuine stability since its creation. Syria has not. Lebanon has not. And the Palestinian question has produced 4 major wars and a continuous low-level conflict that has lasted, in one form or another, since 1948. The Kurdish people remain stateless. The borders drawn with a chinograph pencil in London in 1916 and finalized in Cairo in 1921 have been maintained with astonishing durability by the same forces the Ottoman system once deployed. Violence, external pressure, and the absence of any better answer to the question of how people with different identities share the same geography. The Ottoman Empire did not solve that question. It managed it for a long time, better than anything that replaced it. That is not a romantic claim about empire. It is a historical observation about what happens when you destroy a system without having a coherent answer to the problem that system was addressing. Yet the problem, how do different peoples with different gods and different languages share the same land without destroying each other, is not a problem that history has solved. The Ottomans tried one answer for 600 years. The nation-states that replaced them have been trying their answer for about 100. The balance sheet of the second experiment, measured in deaths and displacements and unresolved conflicts, is not obviously better than the first. In the city of Istanbul, the Suleimaniye Mosque still stands on its hill above the Bosphorus. It was built by an architect who had been taken as a Christian child and made into a Muslim builder in the reign of a sultan who married a slave woman and killed his son at the height of an empire that had simultaneously sheltered Spanish Jews and organized Armenian deportations, broken the walls of Constantinople, and invited the world's displaced peoples to live inside them. The mosque's courtyard contains the tombs of the Sultan and the woman beside him. Its foundation endowment, established in the 16th century to fund the mosque's upkeep in perpetuity, was still functioning in the early 20th century, still paying the salaries of the teachers in its madrises, still feeding people from its soup kitchen, still existing as a legal entity 500 years after the man who created it had died on campaign in Hungary. 500 years. That is the weight of what was built here. Not an empire to admire without reservation, not a civilization to mourn without complication, but something, a sustained attempt at governing plurality, at holding difference together under a single authority, nor at building institutions that outlasted the men who built them, that the world has not yet found a way to replace. The question Osman's chroniclers were trying to answer when they wrote down his dream of the tree whose leaves turned toward the cities of the world was the same question the world is still trying to answer. How do you build something that lasts? The Ottomans built something that lasted 600 years. What it produced, at its best, was a city where a Chinese scholar 4,000 miles away reached for one word to describe it: translators.